Madison Bates had always preferred privacy over popularity. After years of working in high-pressure environments as a logistics strategist for national freight chains, she finally bought a property on the edge of a semi-rural neighborhood, close enough to access major roads but secluded enough to avoid casual drop-ins. The house was modest in size but smartly designed, situated on a slight incline that gave her backyard a quiet, elevated view of thick tree lines and distant hills. She had no children, no partner, and no interest in socializing with neighbors beyond the necessary pleasantries. Her joy came from the small rituals. Morning coffee brewed precisely at 6:30, soft jazz from her Bluetooth speaker echoing into the garden, and the meditative act of tending to her minimalist landscaping, which featured sculpted gravel, drought-resistant plants, and hand-picked stones arranged with almost obsessive attention to symmetry. Her sanctuary, however, wasn't entirely immune to intrusion. From the day she moved in, Madison had been aware of the woman next door, Karen Wexler, white visor, lavender cardigans, the kind of neighbor who introduced herself not with a handshake but a clipboard of community guidelines she'd helpfully summarized for new residents. Karen made her first approach within 2 hours of the moving truck's departure. Her eyes were too alert, her smile strained to the edge of sarcasm as she welcomed Madison with a disingenuous warmth that immediately triggered Madison's internal alert system. When she declined the invitation to the neighborhood orientation brunch, Karen's expression faltered just slightly, just enough to expose the performative layer beneath her hospitality. Madison remained polite, non-committal, and firmly private. Weeks passed and Madison's routine settled in. She installed motion-activated lights along the back fence, not because she feared crime, but because the deer in the area had a habit of eating her fescue grass, and she found the sudden glow of the lights poetic in its own way. Her backyard became a rotating canvas of symmetry and stillness. She changed the arrangement of the stone paths weekly, repositioned her minimalist sculptures, and even installed a weather-resistant mirror sculpture against the southern wall, purely aesthetic, though she later realized it served a second purpose. It visibly disturbed Karen, who was often seen pausing near her side of the fence trying to interpret what she was looking at. The fence itself was regulation height, 6 feet tall, professionally maintained and lined with bamboo slats that Madison had stained herself in rich charcoal. It wasn't meant to provoke, it was meant to disappear. But nothing about Madison's efforts to preserve her peace went unnoticed. Karen began leaving notes, folded slips of paper wedged into the doorframe. Your lights are triggering at odd hours. The reflective object in your yard could be a safety concern. We're concerned about potential glare. At first, Madison ignored them. Then, after finding a hand-drawn diagram illustrating preferred fence alignments taped to her mailbox, she replied with a single note of her own, printed, signed, and dated. My property adheres to all local ordinances and does not fall under your authority. Please do not leave further communications on my residence. That didn't stop Karen. One Friday afternoon, Madison was watering her succulents when she noticed movement along the back fence. A shifting of shadows. A scrape. She turned off the hose and stepped quietly around the side of her home, peering between the slats. There, half hidden behind a thorn bush, was a stepladder. A white sneaker came into view, followed by the hem of lavender slacks. Karen was on the ladder, clutching a small pair of binoculars and leaning dangerously far over the fence. Before Madison could say a word, Karen let out a sharp yelp. Whether startled by a movement or simply overbalanced was unclear, and toppled backward with a crash that silenced the crickets. Madison rushed to the other side of the fence and found Karen sprawled on her back, arm twisted at an odd angle, cheeks flushed with either pain or embarrassment. She refused help, instead demanding that Madison call 911 immediately, because she had suffered a fall while attempting to verify a possible hazard. Madison did as asked. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and Karen, now theatrically stoic, explained that she had been checking her tree line when she fell. Madison said nothing. The medic gave her a look that indicated he didn't buy the story either. After the ambulance left, silence hung over the neighborhood like thick humidity. Madison didn't tell anyone what had really happened. She didn't need to. She assumed Karen's pride would be enough of a deterrent to prevent future incidents. But pride, as it turned out, wasn't Karen's weakness. Obsession was. Within 3 days, Madison received a letter from a private law office. Karen was claiming that Madison's fence was intentionally disorienting, contributing to unsafe conditions that resulted in personal injury on shared boundary space. The legal phrasing danced around the facts without ever stating them outright. Madison didn't panic. Instead, she scanned the letter, consulted an acquaintance who worked in property law, and documented everything. Photographs of the fence, timestamps, weather reports, footage from her doorbell camera. She didn't just react, she prepared. The next morning, she visited the local records office and obtained copies of the zoning map, her property survey, and the original permit for fence installation. All was in order. The law was on her side. But Madison understood something fundamental that Karen seemed to ignore. The truth doesn't always prevent escalation. Late at night, Madison would hear footsteps near her side gate, always stopping just short of triggering the motion light. Sometimes she'd find tiny piles of debris, broken twigs, empty seed packets, crumpled receipts, arranged like accidental offerings. One morning, she discovered a wire hook stuck through a crack in the fence as though someone had been trying to fish for something on her side. It was a game now. Not of law, but of nerves. Madison didn't like games. She liked systems. So she ordered new materials. Custom glass panels, one-way mirror treated, UV protected, double sealed for noise dampening. She replaced the entire fence over the course of a week using contractors who operated under non-disclosure. From her side, the panels appeared as crystal-clear windows into her peaceful garden. From the outside, they reflected the world back like a cold silver wall, a perfect surface that denied entry not just physically, but psychologically. Karen tried to confront her during the installation, claimed it was militaristic, aggressive, unnatural. Madison responded only once, calmly. "I'm within my rights, and you're no longer within my view." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't escalate. She simply reclaimed control. And Karen, for the first time, had to look at her own reflection. The new fence stood pristine and unapologetic. Its surface shimmered subtly under the shifting sunlight, a polished skin of one-way glass that rejected intrusion and absorbed noise like water into sand. From the outside, it resembled an impenetrable mirror, reflecting back only what the observer brought with them: frustration, curiosity, discomfort. From Madison's side, it was nothing short of serene. A clean, uninterrupted panorama of her carefully cultivated yard, now more protected and peaceful than ever. She felt, for the first time in weeks, a sensation close to peace. Not joy, not victory. Those were emotional indulgences she didn't need. But peace. The quiet knowledge that the situation had been addressed with restraint and logic. But peace, she learned quickly, was fragile in the hands of petty people. 3 days after the final panel was installed, Madison found a certified envelope wedged between her screen door and the frame. Inside was a formal complaint addressed to her by name, typed in bold serif font on embossed letterhead from the office of a local property attorney. Karen had filed an official notice of intent to pursue civil damages for intentional mental anguish, obstructive design practices, and installation of visual and sensory deterrents in a residential space. Madison read the document twice. The wording was calculated and absurd, each sentence carefully crafted to sound legal but fall just short of alleging a crime. Karen had accused her, in essence, of creating an environment so reflective, so psychologically taxing, that it caused her regular distress, confusion, and auditory hallucinations triggered by light refracted through unnatural materials. The sheer audacity of the claim should have amused Madison, but she felt none of the smug satisfaction she expected. Instead, she felt the familiar pressure of escalation, that rising tide that made her jaw tighten and her spine pull straight. She didn't reply. She scanned the letter, logged it in her documentation folder, and forwarded a copy to the legal aid firm she had consulted during the fence permit process. A paralegal returned her call later that day and reassured her with a tone of calm experience, explaining that unless Karen could produce evidence of measurable harm or property violation, the complaint was essentially just noise. Still, the paralegal advised caution, noting that people like this often try to exhaust your patience, not your bank account. What changed everything came later that evening. It started with a faint humming sound, just at the edge of hearing. Madison had returned from her evening walk and was preparing a salad in the kitchen when she noticed the low, irregular vibration. At first, she thought it was her refrigerator cycling, but as she moved closer to the window overlooking the backyard, the tone grew slightly more distinct. A strange resonance, like an electric drill running in short bursts. She stepped onto the patio and immediately noticed the absence of her usual tranquility. No crickets, no wind through bamboo, no subtle rattle of wind chimes. Just that persistent, almost subterranean buzz. She walked the perimeter, slowly, flashlight in hand, pausing every few feet to listen. That's when she saw it. Near the far southeast corner of her yard, hidden behind a dense clump of ornamental grass, was a small plastic device wedged under a stone. It was no larger than a matchbox, matte black and affixed with double-sided tape. The hum stopped as she approached. Madison crouched and retrieved it, feeling the light click of a button under her fingers. The device appeared to be a compact battery-operated transmitter. No manufacturer label, no visible controls, just a faint LED that blinked once and then went dark. Madison brought it inside, placed it in a metal box from her tool closet, and did what she always did when something didn't make sense. She researched. Within 10 minutes, she had a strong suspicion that what she'd found was a low-frequency sound emitter, often sold as a nuisance deterrent for animals or trespassers, but in the wrong hands, like Karen's, used to create unease or psychological discomfort in a neighbor dispute. It was legal to buy. Not necessarily legal to deploy without consent on someone else's property, and certainly not legal to affix to someone's yard with the intent of disturbing them. She filed a report with the County Code Enforcement Office the next morning, citing potential harassment and unauthorized electronic placement. She included photos, GPS coordinates, and timestamps from her smart home system that correlated with the strange sound patterns. The clerk she spoke with took her information, then paused and asked a peculiar question. "Are you the property owner with the reflective fencing? We've had some previous noise complaints from your street. Nothing formal, just odd ones." Madison thanked her and hung up. Odd was an understatement. The next incident didn't come with a noise. It came with silence. She noticed it when her package delivery alert stopped working. Madison received shipments regularly, tools, parts, books, household items, and had her delivery system integrated with a smart locker at her gate. But 3 expected packages that week never arrived. Each time she checked the tracking number, the status claimed, "Delivered at front entry." But there was nothing there. No notifications, no boxes, no misplaced parcels in the tall grass. The courier service, when contacted, confirmed that all items had been left at the designated drop site. She reviewed her gate camera footage. Nothing showed up. It took her 2 days to solve the mystery, and she didn't like the answer. Her neighbor, 2 doors down, a retired teacher named Melanie, stopped her one morning as she was walking her trash bin to the curb and said, with visible hesitation, "Hey, I meant to ask, did you get my note? I dropped it in your mailbox about the packages. Thought maybe the wind took it." Madison blinked. No. What note? Melanie glanced around, then lowered her voice. I saw Karen walk over to your gate a few days ago. I was on the porch with my tea, just sitting quiet. She bent down at your drop box and did something. Didn't think much of it until I noticed your packages were piling up at the edge of her garage later. Same boxes I'd seen a courier bring. Madison didn't react, not outwardly. She thanked Melanie, finished taking out the trash, and spent the rest of the day reviewing security footage. Not from the usual cameras, but from a second unit she had installed facing her side path after the fence incident. Sure enough, there it was, a single frame in the early morning where a shadow moved past the gate and ducked out of view. The rest was obstructed, but it was enough. She forwarded the image to her legal contact, filed a non-emergency police report for theft of mail, and sent a formal complaint to the courier company advising them to deliver only with direct signature. Karen didn't respond. Not directly. But 2 days later, Madison found a note pinned to her fence. Not taped, not wedged, pinned through the mirrored surface with a thumbtack as if it were corkboard. The note was handwritten, carefully printed in green ink. It read, "You may be smart, but you're not invincible. Things will balance out." No name, no signature, just that veiled threat, chilling in its calculation. Madison took the note, filed it, then called her lawyer. The game had changed. Karen wasn't merely annoying. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor or a busybody with too much time. She was deliberate, methodical, and increasingly unstable. And Madison, to her own frustration, realized this wasn't going to de-escalate on its own. Boundaries had been tested, warnings ignored. Now came consequences. But the next move wouldn't be a reaction. It would be a response. Madison didn't flinch. She didn't rant or scream or pound on doors demanding explanations. That wasn't her nature. Her control came from deliberate action, from the understanding that leverage isn't about volume. It's about evidence, timing, and application. After the note was pinned to her mirrored fence, after the packages disappeared and were found, soggy and half-opened behind a neighbor's hedgerow, she filed her second official complaint, not with the police, who would do little for a note and a guess, but with the Regional Consumer Protection Office. She included everything. The image of the shadow near her gate, the statement from Melanie, the letter with the veiled threat, the registered mail slip confirming her earlier warning was delivered and acknowledged. She didn't accuse Karen by name. That wasn't necessary. The documentation told the story itself. What she didn't expect, however, was the response it triggered. Less than 48 hours after submitting her complaint, Madison was visited by a pair of county civil code compliance officers. They arrived mid-morning, their white sedan parked askew near the foot of her driveway, and both men were dressed in standard khakis and blue windbreakers with laminated ID badges swinging from lanyards. They were polite, even apologetic, but explained they were required to conduct an in-person assessment due to an anonymous concern about her fencing materials and their potential for causing hazardous glare that might impact traffic or adjacent properties. Madison, already prepared for this exact angle of attack, greeted them calmly, provided the paperwork on her fencing material, including the anti-glare certification from the manufacturer, and escorted them along the perimeter of the yard, pointing out that the fence faced away from any roadways or pedestrian walkways. The men nodded, took a few photos, made notes, and assured her there was nothing out of order. She asked one of them as they were preparing to leave if complaints like this were common. The younger officer hesitated, then shrugged. "Sometimes," he said. "Usually it's more about noise or property lines. Not so much reflective surfaces." His pause said more than his words. They knew the complaint was manufactured. They also knew their job wasn't to investigate intent, just compliance. But for Madison, the visit was confirmation. Karen had gone from passive-aggressive intimidation to strategic manipulation. She wasn't trying to win legally. She was trying to exhaust Madison through attrition, pushing boundaries just enough to keep the system engaged, just enough to make Madison spend her time and energy responding. It wasn't about justice or rules. It was about pressure. That same evening, the pressure took another turn. Madison returned home from a routine supply run and noticed something strange. The gravel strip that ran along the base of her fence, which she raked weekly for aesthetic consistency, was disturbed. Small footprints. Not animal. Narrow, deep, human, walking parallel to the wall as if someone had paced the length of the yard with purpose. She followed the tracks to the back corner of the property, where the bamboo screening ended in a clean concrete post. There, wedged between two slabs, was a narrow plastic tube. She extracted it slowly with gloves and unscrewed the cap. Inside was a rolled sheet of paper. Not a letter, not a threat this time, but a printed catalog page featuring high-powered outdoor security lighting systems. One model was circled. Beneath it, in green pen, the same style as the note, were 4 words. "This is next, sweetie." Madison didn't take it to the police. Not yet. She knew what they'd say. There was no fingerprint, no name, no proof of who placed it. Instead, she forwarded the image to her attorney, then scheduled a private consultation with a neighborhood conflict mediator, a third-party specialist in boundary disputes and chronic interpersonal escalations. She didn't expect peace talks, but she wanted options. If the legal route proved too slow, she needed to understand what channels could allow a formal restraint or cease-and-desist order. The mediator, a sharp woman in her 50s named Carol, listened patiently, read over the printed materials, and nodded slowly. "This is harassment," she said. "Not in the criminal sense, not yet, but in every practical one. You're dealing with someone who doesn't want a resolution. She wants your attention, your irritation. She wants to occupy your bandwidth." Madison asked her what the most effective move would be. Carol answered without pause. Take away her game board. So Madison did. She had her mirrored fence refinished. Not replaced, refinished. She applied a diffusive film that, under direct sunlight, transformed the surface into a chameleon-like screen. During the day, it reflected in soft matte. At dusk, it absorbed ambient color, and at night, it went nearly black. From the inside, the panels still allowed a perfect view of the exterior. From the outside, however, the fence became something altogether more elusive, less a barrier than an aesthetic void. It drove Karen mad. Within a week, she attempted to install a high stepladder near her side of the property, tucked behind her hedges. Madison knew this not from witnessing it, but from the sound. A low clatter at 2 a.m., followed by the muffled hiss of frustration and the unmistakable metallic bounce of a lightweight frame hitting the ground. The next morning, Karen was on her porch with her arm in a sling. No ambulance this time, no dramatic fall into Madison's yard. Just a pale, silent glare as Madison walked her recycling bin to the curb, nodded once in polite neutrality, and returned inside. But silence wasn't surrender. Karen retaliated by targeting Madison's delivery pipeline again. Packages began arriving with slashed seals, resealed poorly. One box, containing solar path lights, had been opened, the contents removed, and filled instead with crumpled newspaper and a dead housefly. The courier was apologetic but confused. "We delivered it sealed," the driver said. "We even took a photo." Madison showed him the replacement box. He took a picture, muttered something about submitting a report, and drove off looking rattled. Madison changed all her delivery preferences to signed only, added a tamper-evident lock to her Dropbox, and posted signage stating that all delivery activity was monitored and recorded. Then she installed a new set of sensors, not on the fence but embedded beneath the gravel near the gate, designed to trigger a silent alert if anything heavier than 15 pounds passed across. That same night, the alert chimed. Madison didn't go outside. She didn't open the window. She waited until morning, and there, in the gravel, was a single pink gardening glove. Torn, dirty, left like an accidental breadcrumb. But nothing Karen ever did was accidental. Madison placed the glove in an evidence bag and, for the first time, went to the sheriff's office in person. She spoke calmly, factually, without embellishment. She presented the package tampering logs, the delivery photos, the documents from the compliance visit, the audio file of the humming device, the letter with the threat, and now the physical item left on her property. She made no demands, just requests: a record on file, an official acknowledgement of the pattern, and a statement from her legal counsel confirming that all documentation would be submitted as part of an escalating nuisance and potential restraining order. The deputy, to his credit, didn't dismiss her. He just said, "It's good you've documented this. People usually come in after something worse happens." Madison left without relief, but with something better: leverage. When she returned home, she found her driveway power-washed, the gravel clean, the fence quiet. But she also found something else. Someone had slipped a letter under her door. Typed, no signature, no green ink, just a single sentence. "I see what you're doing, and it won't help." It wasn't a game anymore. It was a war of attrition, and Madison was done playing defense. The morning began with fog. Not dramatic fog, not the cinematic kind that rolls in with slow menace and covers the ground in ghost-white silence, but the banal, sticky kind that clings to car windows and makes everything feel just slightly more difficult. Madison stood on her porch, sipping black coffee and watching the mist collect in soft clumps around her yard. It was one of those moments where nothing moved, but everything felt coiled, like the breath before a punch. For weeks now, every day had carried tension. She no longer walked her perimeter for exercise or tranquility. She walked it like patrol, eyes scanning, ears straining for the familiar rustle or scrape of her neighbor's passive-aggressive war machine grinding into its next gear. But that morning, the air didn't carry noise. It carried stillness, and that made her more alert than ever. The letter from the sheriff's office had arrived the day before. An official response finally, confirming that a record had been opened based on her statement and submitted evidence. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was momentum. A formal presence had been established, a trail, however thin. Her attorney, in their most recent call, had advised her to remain steady, to avoid provoking Karen while the paperwork for the civil order of protection processed. "Don't match her energy," she said. "You'll just dilute your position. We're playing long game now." Madison had agreed, but in the quiet, she felt the slow-building weight of the waiting. It was one thing to respond. It was another to sit and let escalation roll forward like tidewater creeping under a locked door. So, when the fog began to lift and she noticed the faint outlines of something different on Karen's property, something angular, tall, and wrapped in a blue tarp, she knew better than to ignore it. From her upstairs window, the object looked like scaffolding or possibly a camera rig. By noon, it had disappeared. Not dismantled, just relocated. Hidden. And that was confirmation. Karen was adapting. The woman was no longer satisfied with sabotage by suggestion. Now she was studying, calculating. Whatever came next would be a step forward in boldness. And it was. Later that same day, Madison received a phone call from a private mediation firm. A soft-spoken woman introduced herself as a representative working with residential disputes and asked whether Madison would be open to a structured conversation with a concerned neighbor who had expressed a willingness to resolve ongoing misunderstandings. Madison, curious, asked the name of the complainant. The woman paused, then replied, "Karen Wexler." Madison asked for the date of the complaint. It had been filed a week prior, right after the glove incident. This wasn't a genuine invitation. It was a maneuver. Karen had attempted to preemptively position herself as the aggrieved party, setting the stage for whatever came next. Madison declined the mediation politely, explaining that a formal legal process had already been initiated, and any discussion would now require representation. The woman thanked her, and the call ended. But the unease lingered. That evening, the unease turned to action. She was preparing dinner, grilling vegetables on the patio, when she heard the sharp crack of wood against wood, not from her yard, but behind the fence. Then a thud, then silence. She turned off the grill, stepped toward the mirrored wall, and froze. There, at the center of one of the panels, was a perfectly round impact mark, spider-webbed, faintly glinting with stress fractures. Someone had thrown something hard and precisely. She retrieved a ladder from her shed, climbed just enough to peek over the top without exposing herself, and scanned the ground. Nothing at first. Then she spotted it. A white ceramic garden stone, half buried, resting against the base of Karen's tree. A throw from that angle would have matched the arc. She descended, gloves on, and inspected the damage. Superficial, but not ignorable. A deliberate shot, symbolic more than functional. A test of her patience. Madison didn't call anyone this time. She simply updated the log, added photos, and reinforced the inner panel with shatterproof overlay she'd ordered weeks earlier, almost as a precaution. Her lawyer had warned her about this stage. People like this, when they don't get a rise, sometimes they escalate just to see if they still can. The advice had been metaphorical, but now it felt literal. That night, as she sat inside with all lights off, watching the monitor feed from her infrared cameras, she caught the moment. A figure moving near the boundary. Slow, uncertain, then freezing when the side floodlights snapped on, triggered by motion. The figure turned, not toward the house, but toward the panel it had previously struck. It stared, motionless. And in that moment, Madison realized something elemental. This wasn't just conflict. It wasn't property or privacy anymore. For Karen, this was personal mythology. She had invented a story where she was the hero, protecting the neighborhood from the mysterious recluse next door who built walls and spoke in legal terms instead of warm welcomes. Karen wasn't trying to win. She was trying to make herself matter, and that made her dangerous. The following morning, a letter arrived not for Madison but for her employer. A formal inquiry into her off-site conduct, citing vague concerns about aggressive property modifications and mental wellness. It was unsigned, unofficial, but it was enough to trigger an internal HR check. Her supervisor, embarrassed but procedural, called to inform her. Madison listened, then calmly provided a full explanation and digital documentation of the dispute, including dates, images, and attorney correspondence. The supervisor apologized, assured her it would go no further, and commended her for handling it with professional clarity. Madison ended the call and sat still for a moment. Karen had crossed into her career now, and that was a line Madison had hoped would never be tested. She didn't retaliate, she refined. The cameras were adjusted, elevated, filtered through a cloud-based AI that flagged human patterns with sharper efficiency. The lighting was replaced with warm-spectrum LEDs to avoid future complaints of brightness. The gravel strips were lined with pressure-sensitive mesh that could detect exact footfall weights and timestamps. She removed anything that could be interpreted as bait or provocation. The yard became less of a garden, more of a calculated perimeter. Karen, for her part, began staying inside more. Her window blinds now twitched in irregular intervals. Packages stopped arriving. The tarp returned to the backyard only to disappear again. The silence had become mutual. But it wasn't peace, it was prelude. Because Madison knew something now that couldn't be unlearned. When someone stops reacting to being denied power, they often start finding new ways to take it. And whatever Karen had planned next, Madison was no longer simply preparing to endure it. She was preparing to end it. There was something unnerving about how quiet Karen became. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't surrender. It was the kind of silence that suggested recalibration, the stillness between waves when the tide is deciding how hard it wants to return. Madison noticed it immediately. No movement near the hedge line, no glances from the front porch, no rustling at the fence. Days went by without so much as a misplaced planter or echoing scrape of tools at dawn. And yet, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like strategy. Karen had learned the terrain, and now she was choosing a different weapon. It started with the letter, again, not delivered by post, but left in a transparent sleeve pinned to Madison's gate. No envelope, no signature, just bolded text in a font so precise it felt sterile. It accused her of violating municipal environmental codes, specifically referencing the fence's potential to trap and overheat wildlife due to its reflective nature. Madison read the sentence twice, then 3 times, and blinked. Wildlife, trapped by light? It was a claim so absurd it bordered on performance art. But this wasn't theater. This was bureaucracy as a tool of siege. By noon that same day, a city animal control officer was parked outside her home. A tall man with a clipboard and a gentle voice knocked on her door, apologized for the inconvenience, and said they were following up on a complaint about potential animal distress due to unnatural materials along private fencing. Madison offered him water, then calmly walked him around the property, explained the materials, showed him the manufacturer's data sheet, and even offered thermal readings taken from her exterior sensors. The officer, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, thanked her and scribbled a few lines onto his clipboard. As he turned to leave, he said something that landed like a nail driven into soft wood. "We've had complaints from that address before. You're not the first." It wasn't news. It was confirmation. Karen had a pattern, and now Madison had the record to prove it. But Karen wasn't done. Days later, another officer arrived, this time from sanitation services. A report had been filed about accumulated inorganic materials posing a neighborhood hazard. When asked to elaborate, the man hesitated, glanced at his form, and read, "Mirrored structures, hard mineral surfaces, plastic mesh." Madison was ready. She showed him the permits, the receipts, and the installation certifications. Again, he apologized and left. Again, a layer of her patience dissolved. This wasn't just escalation. It was guerrilla warfare by clipboard. But Karen finally overplayed her hand when she crossed into digital sabotage. Madison received an alert from her internet provider that her IP address had been flagged for unusual outbound activity. Concerned, she ran diagnostics. Her home network, which was professionally installed and encrypted, showed no sign of external breach. But her router logs displayed repeated connection attempts from an unknown MAC address, attempts that started only days after the city visits began. The address had piggybacked briefly onto her guest network, which had remained idle and unsecured since installation. That was her mistake, and Karen, or someone working with her, had found it. She closed the network, changed the credentials, and downloaded the log history. But the implications were heavier than the act itself. This wasn't about annoying her now, and this was about information. Access, exposure, discreditation. Madison had always known Karen to be obsessive. Now she was learning how far that obsession could reach when equipped with time, resentment, and a working knowledge of loopholes. She brought the logs to her lawyer. They discussed escalation. The evidence had moved from suggestive to circumstantial, but with the cumulative file, it was nearing the threshold for a civil harassment injunction. The lawyer agreed to draft the filing. It would take time, several days for the paperwork to process and serve, but it would finally change the dynamic. Karen would be formally notified that her behavior was being monitored under the authority of the court. That, Madison hoped, might finally force a stop. It did the opposite. Karen retaliated the only way she still could, through her influence. A week later, a notice was posted in Madison's mailbox. A request for inspection by the Neighborhood Zoning Committee, prompted by multiple community concerns about property compliance and aesthetic disruption. It was all dressed in neutral language, but the message was unmistakable. Karen had activated her circle, weaponizing the timid and indifferent to serve as tools in her campaign. The inspection was scheduled for Monday. Madison spent the weekend documenting every element of her property: photos, receipts, approval forms, even the paint codes used on her fence and planters. She wasn't worried about failing the inspection. She was worried about the narrative it could create. If Karen managed to frame the issue as a community-based concern rather than personal vendetta, it would shift the burden of proof back onto Madison. That was her true goal now. Not to win, but to redefine the game until Madison was too tired to keep playing. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was that Madison didn't operate on emotion. She didn't yell or retaliate. She planned. And that weekend, she made a decision she hadn't previously allowed herself to consider. She began the process of installing a second internal fence, one hidden behind the mirrored structure, constructed of matte black composite panels, spaced narrowly and reinforced with sound-dampening insulation. It would serve no aesthetic purpose. It wouldn't be visible from the outside, but it would offer her complete environmental control. No more shadows cast by nearby movement, no more false echoes bouncing off her perimeter, no more distorted sounds through hollow gaps. It was a shell within a shell, and it would finalize the message her mirrored wall had only begun to deliver. Privacy is not a request. It's a decision. The inspector arrived Monday morning, a composed woman in a gray windbreaker and flat shoes, clipboard in hand, polite but unyielding. She walked the property, asked a few procedural questions, took photos. Madison answered with clarity, precision, and documentation. When the inspector reached the mirrored wall, she paused, raised an eyebrow, and asked, "This design, it's legal." "It's legal," Madison replied, handing her a packet with all city zoning allowances, manufacturing specs, and a signed confirmation from the initial code review. The inspector flipped through it, nodded, and said, "I can see why someone would find it intimidating." Madison didn't flinch. "It's not here to be comforting," she said. The inspection ended. The report was filed. No violations, no citations, but no peace either. That night, a rock hit her side window, not hard enough to break, just enough to crack. When she stepped out to investigate, she found a single word scratched into the dirt beside her gate, written with the heel of a shoe or perhaps a stick. Unnatural. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she went inside and called her lawyer again. "Submit the injunction," she said, "and add that she's trying to redefine the terms of reality." The day the injunction was granted, Madison didn't celebrate. She didn't exhale or allow herself a flicker of relief. She understood the distinction between authority and control. The legal document was a formality, a declaration that enough evidence now existed for a court to recognize the situation as harassment. It was not enforcement. It was not protection. It was a flag planted in hostile ground, signaling the start of something that had no intention of stopping simply because paper said so. Still, it shifted the terrain. Karen would be served. A record would exist. The slow suffocation of plausible deniability would begin to fold in on her, and Madison knew that this would be the moment where Karen either unraveled or turned violent. The service happened quietly. A deputy, uniformed but unarmed, walked up Karen's drive on a cool Tuesday morning and rang the doorbell. Madison didn't watch it live. She let the motion alert ping quietly in the background while she reviewed invoices for the internal fencing still under construction. When she checked the footage hours later, it was mundane. The deputy handed the papers through a cracked door. Karen's face was shadowed, unreadable. There were no raised voices, no dramatic rejections. Only a slow closing of the door, followed by an hour of stillness. Madison marked the time, updated her log, and waited. The retaliation arrived that night. It began with a car alarm. 3 sharp bursts, then silence. Madison sat up in bed, heart steady but alert. Her cameras showed no movement. No cars parked improperly. Nothing visible. 15 minutes later, the backyard sensor tripped. A shape, hunched, quick, moved low along the fence, passing out of frame before resolution could sharpen. She rewound, replayed. The figure wasn't tall enough to be Karen, unless she was crawling, but the intent was clear. Movement just inside the edge of perception. A message. "I'm still here." She called it in. Non-emergency line, factual, calm. She didn't exaggerate, just described what she saw, how it corresponded to the ongoing report, and asked for it to be logged. The officer on the phone said they'd note it, send a patrol if something repeated. Madison thanked him, hung up, and then made her decision. She retrieved the emergency floodlight from her garage, a portable halogen beast meant for construction sites, and mounted it to the apex of her inner fence wall. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to reveal. The next time the sensor triggered, the light would blaze white into the perimeter, turning any stealth into spectacle. And just in case that didn't work, she rigged the outer cameras with audio capture and synced them to a cloud-based archival system accessible from any device. This wasn't defense. This was extraction. She wanted exposure, traceability, a timeline that couldn't be denied when the next court date came. The second attempt came 3 nights later. No car alarm this time. No testing. Just the crack of splintering wood. The old tool shed on the edge of Madison's yard, used mostly for garden implements, stood ajar, lock broken. The sensor caught it. The floodlight roared to life, and there, caught in full, harsh clarity, was Karen. Not sneaking, not crawling. Just standing, shoulders hunched forward, eyes wide, caught mid-motion with a small pry bar in her hand and a canvas tote at her feet. For 1 full second, she didn't move. Then she dropped the tool, turned, and bolted. Not toward her own yard, but around the side into the hedgerow, disappearing before Madison could reach the door. Madison didn't chase. She didn't shout. She walked slowly back inside, retrieved her phone, and called the emergency line. This time, the officers responded in less than 10 minutes. Madison handed them the footage. 2 deputies reviewed it on her kitchen tablet, then nodded without expression. One asked if she wanted to press charges. She answered yes, clearly and without hesitation. The break-in, combined with the court injunction and documented history, triggered an immediate response. They walked to Karen's home. There was a knock, a conversation, and then the unmistakable sight of Karen stepping outside, hands trembling, mouth moving faster than her thoughts could coordinate. She wasn't arrested on the spot. Not yet. But a criminal report was filed, and she was given a formal warning. Violation of a court order, attempted property damage, trespassing, all of it now real. On paper. In law. When the officers returned to inform Madison, one of them looked tired, as if this kind of thing had become too common. He said, "You did everything right. Most people lose it way before this." Madison didn't reply. She was thinking of the tote bag Karen had left behind. Inside, they'd found bolt cutters, gardening gloves, a spray can, and a printed sheet with a photo of Madison's fence. Circled in red, annotated in furious handwriting, exposure points. It wasn't vandalism she was planning. It was deconstruction. Karen didn't speak to Madison again. Not directly. But in the following days, her yard transformed. Furniture disappeared, curtains closed, her car was gone for stretches of hours. Madison suspected she was meeting with lawyers, or perhaps retreating into whatever support system she still had left. The neighborhood watched quietly, unsure of which version of the story to believe. But it didn't matter. The system was finally in motion, and it wasn't Madison who had to prove anything anymore. A week later, a formal notice was delivered to Madison from the district court. A hearing had been scheduled to finalize the protective order, with the possibility of further charges pending investigation of the break-in. It was the beginning of closure, or at least containment. Madison didn't feel victorious. She felt surgical, like a wound was being properly cleaned, finally, after festering too long under gauze and denial. The night before the hearing, she found something new. A single white envelope, no markings, placed gently inside her locked mailbox, a breach in itself. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, anonymous. It said, "You won't win. You've made her sick. That doesn't go away." Madison read it once, then slid it into her case file and closed the drawer. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because the next morning, for the first time since this began, she walked into a courtroom and knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had done everything exactly right, and this time, someone else would have to explain themselves. The hearing was quiet. There were no dramatic objections, no confrontations, no last-minute theatrics that people expect from courtrooms they've only seen in films. Instead, it was procedural, almost clinical. Madison sat at one end of the table with her lawyer, calm, composed, the folder in front of her closed but ready, like a loaded weapon she never needed to unholster. Karen sat across from her, flanked by a court-appointed attorney, her eyes downcast and her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The judge, an older man with deep lines around his mouth and the permanent frown of someone who had seen too many of these cases, reviewed the evidence quickly. The reports, the footage, the officer's statement, and the existing injunction were more than enough. He didn't ask Madison to speak. He didn't ask Karen either. He simply ruled. The order was granted. Formal, restrictive, enforceable. Karen was forbidden from approaching Madison's property, making contact or engaging in any further surveillance or interference, direct or indirect. Any violation would now be considered criminal, not civil. The courtroom emptied quietly. Madison didn't look back as she left. She didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. That afternoon, Madison returned home and stood at the edge of her yard, looking at the mirrored fence that had once been a provocation but now felt like a monument. It no longer felt like armor. It felt like a boundary, not just for keeping Karen out, but for keeping something else in. The part of her that had grown so used to defending, to anticipating, to bracing for the next escalation. The silence now wasn't threatening. It was earned, and it held a different kind of weight. She walked her perimeter one last time, slow, deliberate, not to check for threats but to reclaim the space. Every step traced the months behind her, the moments she hadn't realized she was building a defense not only against her neighbor, but against the erosion of her own peace of mind. The internal fence was finished 2 days later, black composite, silent and minimal, barely visible through the bamboo and the mirrored panels. It gave the yard a sense of quiet depth, a layered separation that made the space feel folded in on itself, like a private room in the open air. She planted low grass beneath it, the kind that didn't need trimming, and let the lines between nature and structure blur again. There was no victory dance, no toast to closure, just routine, just movement. Just Madison putting her life back into rhythm, one neutral action at a time. The neighborhood adjusted slowly. Some people offered polite waves, unsure whether to say anything. A few avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to take sides. But a week after the hearing, Melanie, the neighbor who had first spoken up, left a box of lemons and a note on Madison's porch. The handwriting was tidy, a little nervous. It read, "I'm sorry I didn't say more sooner. You handled it better than I ever could have. I hope you find peace now." Madison read it twice, then tucked the note into her kitchen drawer and squeezed the lemons into a pitcher that same evening. Karen's house went dark for a while, the shades drawn, the mail uncollected. Then, slowly, signs of movement. A realtor's sign appeared. Then it vanished. Then came a pair of movers. No commotion, no farewell. Just an empty driveway. Then silence. Madison never saw her leave. But one morning, the house stood quiet and empty. The windows clean and bare. The tension drained from its frame like air from a deflated balloon. The threat, once constant and shapeless, had finally exhaled. Not with a crash, not with a scream, but with retreat. Weeks passed, then months, and Madison began to notice other sounds again. Not alarms, not footsteps, but wind. Birds. The shifting rustle of her bamboo when it swayed in the breeze. The peace didn't return all at once. It returned in fragments, in the slow uncoiling of nerves, in the subtle joy of doing nothing and feeling safe while doing it. She didn't tear down the fence. She didn't need to. It wasn't about shutting people out anymore. It was about knowing where she ended and the world began, and protecting that line, not with cameras or spotlights or injunctions, but with her own refusal to shrink. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Madison sat on her back steps with a mug of tea, her dog curled at her feet, the yard dimming into shadow. The mirrored fence caught the last bit of daylight and bent it gently into gold, reflecting the trees, the sky, the softness of everything the conflict had almost erased. She watched it quietly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass plaque she'd had made weeks earlier, before she even knew how things would end. She stood, crossed the yard, and mounted it just beside the garden gate. It read, "Some people watch, others build. Choose wisely." And with that, she turned back toward the house, the sky now fully dark, her yard finally still. Not empty, just hers.